Walter again here at Snop Now, and today I am interviewing Melissa Yao, the Executive Director of the National Trafficking Shelter Alliance. And how are you doing today, Melissa?
I'm doing good. I'm in the DC area. It's cherry blossom season. It's looking pretty.
Nice, nice. I heard about those in Japan, but I've actually never been to DC to see them either.
I'll be honest, my grandparents flew from California 3 years in a row to see them and never did because it's always a surprise when they bloom.
Oh, wow. That's disappointing three times. But yeah, we're glad to have you on today. And yeah, well, you again, as mentioned, you're the executive director of the National Trafficking Sheltered Alliance. And yeah, before we jump into that, what attracted you in your background to get involved with the fight against human trafficking, which is a global issue that definitely needs more attention?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think it really stems from when I was growing up. I grew up in a very agricultural community in Central Valley of California, where 80% of my school was first generation Mexican immigrants. And I remember thinking I understood poverty. It was a low income area, and then at 17 went to Mexico for the first time, and we drove across the border. And if you've never done that before, it's so overwhelming because you drive across the border and you look behind you and you have America, sky rises, glass buildings, everything looks nice. And then I'm looking in front of me and you've got barred windows with no glass. You've got people that are so malnourished that I could see their ribs. And for the first time, I experienced desperate poverty. And throughout my career, my journey, I pursued ways to alleviate poverty. One way being working in policy in DC with the anti-hunger lobbyist firm. And the more you study poverty, the more you realize that more than 80% of those impoverished across the globe are women and children. Women being much more vulnerable to the effects of poverty. And one of what I think the most horrific forms of that oppression is sex trafficking. And through that, I kind of have been committed to doing everything that I could to help those that have experienced trafficking and helping them overcome their trauma.
And in that tying to your work with the National Trafficking Sheltered Alliance, and how does the organization go about helping victims? Is it just victims of sex trafficking, or is it labor trafficking as well?
Yeah, labor trafficking is certainly a part of it. And to be honest, Walter, I think one of the saddest pieces of this is they often overlap. So if someone is being labor trafficked, oftentimes the sexual abuse is an additional component to the labor trafficking. So yes to both. But here in the US, one of the things that we at NTSA do is to facilitate a referral system. So when a victim is identified either through themselves, through law enforcement, medical personnel, they can contact us and we can find placement for them in over 130 programs in 36 states throughout the country. And of that, more than 90% of our referrals are US citizens. Most of them also biologically female. And so we have a very, very typical process of finding placement for them, recognizing that it is happening in our own backyards. And so we have to step in as a solution for our own people as much as it is for international victims as well. And so oftentimes domestic victims are explicitly sex trafficking victims. Labor trafficking often comes with international immigration.
And so just to be clear, so the referrals are survivors looking for placement, or is that what the referral? Okay. And as far as that goes, like, what are some of the numbers that you're seeing per year as far as referrals to the NTSA?
Yes, well, I can give you two data points to help understand the magnitude of this problem because we're a very, very small percentage of the solution. We, on average, help about 25 survivors a week find placement throughout the country. So not a big number, but studies are showing that there is an anticipated more than 135,000 sex trafficking victims just right here in the US. We know that there is more than 8,000 brothels throughout the US, and we know that that number is growing. For example, I've been tracking brothels or illicit massage parlors in Chicago for the past few years, and I've seen it increase by more than 30 to 40% year after year, including through the pandemic, to where now Chicago has over 360 brothels alone.
But when we're getting into issues like that, how do you differentiate people that are consensually and those are being kind of forced, coerced, or manipulated being there?
Well, tell me what you mean by consensual.
They choose to work in that field.
Well, I think that we have to question choice, because I've heard this question many times. And I think what's so hard, like, because one of the arguments that I hear often when it comes to, is it a choice? Is it consensual? Is that oftentimes it's because it's their only choice, that it's their only way that they could make money enough to feed their family. And if that's the case, then I would argue it's not a choice, it's a default. And if it's a default, we as a society should not just sit back and say, well, there's nothing better, so good for you, let's support you being repeatedly utilized for someone else's sexual pleasure.
Well, not to throw a specific company under the bus, but if someone's working at McDonald's on a $7.25 minimum wage, they could say the same thing, but no one tries to take that choice away. So isn't that a line that has to be looked at? Because I mean, because there's a huge difference between I choose to do something and then I am forced, coerced, manipulated, and I have no choice into this. How
Yeah.
I mean, when we're looking at that, because there's a lot of organizations that look into where you differentiate between you have a choice, you want to do this, fine. You don't, you're being forced. We want to get you out of that. So how do you go about doing that? Because I've definitely heard from people who are like, no, I enjoy this, want to do it. So why are you trying to quote unquote save me? Kind of thing. So,
well, first of all, nobody should be saving anybody. Like the people that claw their way out of the horrific forms of sex trafficking, which
right.
That's trafficking versus forced or chosen prostitution. So let's just segment this to explicitly sex trafficking. Nobody's rescuing these victims. They're outrageously courageous and strong. I tell people all the time, when the zombie apocalypse happens, you find yourself some survivors of trafficking because they are survivors. They're the ones going to be standing at the end. I'm finding them to survive the zombie apocalypse, okay? So nobody's rescuing them, nobody's saving them, but we're all going to need them when the apocalypse happens. So that's a different thing. You know, there's arguments on both sides on, is it a choice? Is it, I mean, I've heard so many agencies argue that even just the concept of monetary exchange for sex makes it coercive because it's coming from a economic disadvantage, right? The buyer has. Well, you're rolling your eyes. I don't have to.
I'm not rolling my eyes.
We could talk about something else if you'd like. I don't mean to be offensive. This is just the argument that we hear.
It's like everyone goes to work for a monetary exchange. I was like,
well, yes, Walter, everybody goes to work. But here's, okay, getting a little bit graphic. And again, there's different arguments. I'm not trying to be combative for either or. I've had survivors that have been actively in the life at that moment, choosing to be in the life, that was also trafficked by 3 different gorilla pimps who had their gorilla pimps being the aggressive pimp, who literally had her jaw broken. So I think it's seasonal, right? Based on where they're at. So I'm not saying whether it's a choice or not, but I'm just saying that there's different arguments. I will say it's slightly offensive to compare someone's body being used for sexual purposes to working at McDonald's, because if you are in the middle of making a burger and you decide, you know what, I don't like this, I'm out. You have full agency to walk out of that building. If you are in the middle of a sex act with the buyer, there is no agency to walk out of that room, whether you have a choice or not.
Well, take
You
the
can't change your mind.
well,
You can't.
take the money out of it. What's the difference between what you're describing and what happens without a monetary transaction? And there's millions of individuals in the United States that have gone through that. Like it's where I think the focus
Yeah.
on is the direct money, and I don't think
Yeah.
that's the right kind of way to look at that, because it's like, because we're talking about assault and aggression, not consensual activity. Once someone starts breaking consent, I think that's what a
Yeah.
lot of people I've heard argue about.
Yeah.
So it's like, again, like if you were trying to leave your job at work after you were off the clock and your boss said no, they're committing a crime.
Yeah.
And so that's where I come in with that. So I don't, so I think that's the key thing with me is consent being here, because I care a lot about like consent, use the right columns about it. And like
Yeah.
when you're in a relationship, it's like your consent deserves to be valued no matter what situation that is. So I
Yeah.
think that's kind of where I look at that specific transaction from.
Yeah. Totally agree. I think consent is absolutely vital in any of this.
Right. And so when when we looking at does does the NTSA look to help law enforcement find traffickers, or is it mostly the referral for shelters?
We don't look to find anybody. We're not identifiers. So think of us like we're like Uber. You've got the victim or the survivor, and you've got the program or resources that they need to process through their trauma. You've got the rider and you've got the driver. We're in the middle just trying to connect the people.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, yeah, because I did look over kind of your accreditation phase, and there was a lot of steps, and the very last one that definitely stuck out, where you detail how the organization has to not try to force any beliefs on a survivor. So how
Yeah.
does the NTSA kind of uh, check that? I guess that's a way to put it.
Are you talking about our standard on levels of faith integration?
Yeah, where you said that it was like the last time, where it's like we make sure that you're not forcing anything on anyone. You just try to help them, and that's the end of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an important piece. For some survivors, like anybody, really, faith can be a vital part of our spiritual health, our journey to healing, overcoming trauma. It's a big part of that piece of you. And for others, spiritual abuse was actually part of the trauma, whether it was the spiritual leader, their pastor, their priest that was their early childhood abuser, or the abuse was happening in the church, or the church was instigating it. And so what we try to do is find the best placement for a survivor based on what their level of comfortableness is and when they're placed in the program. We've got to go beyond just asking, do you have a bed? And
Right.
ask more questions. What level of accountability do you want? Do you want to be living independently? Kind of this idea that you have check-ins once in a while to make sure you're on track reaching your personal goals of healing? Or do you want 24-hour accountability where they're helping you work through your classes and have tutoring and health on how to cook healthy food? Really, it should be up to the survivor where they choose their healing journey to take place.
And so so I guess that brings up something else. Is like, would you say that's a common occurrence, is for referrals that come from and they're stating that this happened at my church and I don't know anyone to talk to, or is that rare? What do you say about that?
Oh gosh, Walter, that's a really great question. And honestly, I don't have any data to back that up. We don't track where or how their trauma took place. I can just say anecdotally that I've heard it happen very often, whether it was leadership in the church or the church was an enabler. I had one survivor that shared that her, along with her trafficker, attended church 3 times a week,
Oh,
really engaged in the church community where they were at, and that the church knowingly knew that he was selling her on a regular basis. So when it went to trial and she testified against him, and he did get convicted, he was explicitly legally defined as a trafficker. the church community actually sat on his side and actually supported him.
Wow.
So she calls them the church people. But through her healing journey, got involved with other people that were people of faith, but not necessarily connected to a church. She calls them Jesus people. So you got the church people and you got the Jesus people. So is her faith the same as what it looked like when she was part of this organized church? No, it's not. But it is just as vital as she needed it to be for her healing.
So how do you at NTSA go? I'm assuming that's a very extensive process. How do you gauge whether or not an organization is trying to force anything upon someone?
Yeah, gosh, Walter, super great question. And I'll just be honest, our accreditation program is really intense. It takes between 10 to 12 months to get verified through our accreditation program, and it is really involved. We have to have documentation, we have to have site visits, we do interviews with survivors that are in the program, have graduated the program, staff, and we choose the staff that we interview. The facilitators don't get to choose because we want it to be unbiased. It is really complicated. It's really comprehensive, but overall, I think it's really worth it.
Okay, yeah, that's because I read through that and I was like, wow, this is a lot of steps.
It is a lot. Yeah, I'll be honest, it's pretty daunting when programs start the process. But I'll tell you what, we're seeing a wonderful increase in the level of services being offered to survivors through it. So I'm really, really proud of it.
And how many current, I guess there would be organizations or locations across the United States do you have as referrals?
Well, we have 130 organizations that currently receive referrals from us. Now, not all of those have gone through our accreditation program. They can choose to be accredited by us, but again, it's a pretty tedious process. So eventually, hopefully they all go through that, but not yet.
Okay. And so you said that takes about 10, 12 months of a process to go through?
It's a long time. Yeah, a lot of interviewing. We review board meeting minutes and their social media, because I don't know if you saw, Walter, but one of our standards is the way that one of our standards is that you don't use survivors' stories as part of your marketing or fundraising campaign if the survivor is still in that program. And that's really important to us at NTSA, because if a survivor is in the program, oftentimes they're dependent on these agencies for housing, for food, for reaching their academic goals, for counseling, like literally everything is completely dependent on them. So if an agency comes and says, hey, do you mind if we share your story? They say yes, because they can't comprehend that there is not going to be any negative consequences to saying no. So we say you cannot use survivors currently dependent on you for fundraising purposes. But when they graduate the program and they're not dependent on you, and they want to use their story to help elevate, the work being done that help them overcome their journey, I think it's great.
I think that's a great point to touch on. What if you were advising an organization on, I get, because a lot of also what the accreditation process says, make sure it's kind of trauma focused. How do you make sure that, I guess, organizations are helping victims that came from these really rough situations don't re-traumatize or increase their trauma or bring up something traumatic? Does that just come from official training, or how does one incorporate that into it?
Yeah, there is some wonderful training out there, and it's actually vital. And not just one training, but we encourage agencies to actually take trauma-informed training multiple times. It's been frustrating to me of how many agencies say, oh, we're trauma-informed because they watched a 10-minute video on YouTube. They have to go deeper than that. So we provide training, we encourage training, we have trauma-informed therapists that we recommend to people to do comprehensive trainings. It is a really important part. And a lot of these trauma-informed trainers also do program assessments to evaluate the effectiveness of how they're integrating trauma-informed care. It is an important lens to be serving these survivors through, for sure.
Are there any, I guess, programs that NTSA would recommend for that, or do you not get involved in that process?
Oh, you mean programs that offer trauma-informed training?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Oh, I do. I have my favorites, and I can give a shout out. That's okay.
Yes.
I don't have to.
Oh, you
You
can.
hesitated. Well, there was a hesitation.
You can. It's fine.
Oh, Dr. Dan Sartor is a brilliant, brilliant psychologist. He's based out of Atlanta, Georgia, and he's done training for many residential programs across the country. And then you have Dr. Becca Johnson. She's based out of Washington State. She's actually done trauma-informed training as well as vicarious trauma training, which means that even if you haven't experienced that trauma, you've walked alongside someone with that trauma for so much, you embrace that trauma yourself. It's a psychological reaction. She's done that across the globe so many times in all over from Asia to Latin America. So those are my two most favorite. I just think that they're brilliant.
Yeah, that's definitely good to hear. And I guess like I guess that's a good question is what was the process of creating NTSA and being a um part of that the building process of the organization and watching it grow because you've been a part of since for 8 years now, was it?
About five, actually.
5 years,
Yeah.
5
It feels like
years.
eight, feels like 18. Can I be honest? Yeah. No.
Yeah.
No, it's great. Yeah, about 5 years ago, at that point, I had been working in residential care, so like long-term care with survivors, for about 5 years. And honestly, Walter, I was so frustrated. I was frustrated at seeing survivors go back into the life. They're leaving the program, going back into their trauma. I was frustrated that we had policies in place that seemed to be causing more harm than did good. So started connecting with other programs across the country to see like, what are you doing that's working? What are you also struggling with? Like, what are some areas that we can all just learn from each other to do this work better? And that's how it happened. 2016, a few of us gathered in Chicago, and there's about 16 of us there, to be honest. And we just started sharing like what was working and what wasn't working. And so then the next year we got together again and it ended up being 75 people. And then the next year we officially launched NTSA. There was 24 organizations that said, yeah, let's learn together. Let's grow together. Let's challenge each other together. And fast forward 5 years, we're now at over 130. And I think doing a lot of good work by working together.
And is so how does the organization grow? Is it through donations? Is it just through organizations going through the referral process, or how does that process look?
Uh, well, I mean, so our membership grows through just connecting with new organizations. So like if I go down to, I was just in the Orlando, Florida area. Well, I go and I meet with those organizations. I hear like how they're struggling, how we can help support them. And it just kind of evolves from there, growing our membership. Funding wise, we're privately funded. So Walter, happy to have a receive a check from you if that's what you're offering. No, that got awkward. I'm sorry. No, it's cool. It's cool. It's cool. No pressure. No pressure, Walter.
Uh, you have a fun personality.
Honestly, when you're in this field, I've been in the anti-trafficking work for 11 years, and it is the darkest of the darkest. I've heard horror stories that keep me awake at night, knowing that there's humans out there that can brutalize other people so terribly. And you just have to choose to see the good in this world. You choose to focus on the positives and to laugh when you can. Otherwise, I would cry every single day.
I guess that does also bring up another point. Do you see because I still from what I've researched and seen is especially on the labor trafficking front, there seems to be kind of a blind eye or people don't want to recognize it what it is, especially when it's in the labor field. Do you think there's more attention paid to it to trafficking now in the United States, or is it still something that, from what you've seen, there needs to be kind of a more conversation on?
Walter, you ask great questions. So here's my response to that. Are more people aware of trafficking today than they were 10 years ago? Without a doubt, yes. I know this because everywhere I go, even including my grandmother's funeral, people find out what I did and somehow say, oh, I've learned about that because I watched a documentary or went to a training. So that's true. But what is devastating to me is despite there being an increase of awareness, we have seen a drastic decline in cases and convictions against trafficking. The recent study that came out a few months ago, was it the ILO? Oh gosh, I get all these government agency letters mixed up. So now I sound bad. Oh gosh, can we delete? Is there any erasing? Anyways, one of those like ILO, International Labor Organization. I know it. Walter, are you impressed? ILO. I got it. Came out and indicated that we have seen a drastic decrease globally on trafficking cases. So is awareness increasing? Sure. Is the impact being seen? Absolutely not.
Yeah, that is just a tad bit depressing.
Oh,
Because it's something at Stop Now we look into and try to shed a light on. That's why I invited you here today, and it's, I mean, I guess, yeah, of course, one country can't be responsible for all of it, but what if there's more awareness now, because I know, even though this created a big dramatic way of it, I brought this up last week, the movie Taken, and people started looking at that, it's like, is this how it all happens? It's like, no, it's not at all how it typically happens in these cases. That was for Hollywood to be entertaining.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
so what are
I have a skill set. What does he say?
Yeah,
I have a skill set you won't like. Oh, I ruined
yeah,
it.
yeah, and the whole I'm gonna find you and I'm gonna kill you. Good luck.
Liam Neeson. Liam
Yeah.
Neeson.
So what? So I guess how can organizations help, law enforcement more to find these people, or to help people who, well, no one wants to be trafficked. So it's like, how do we raise awareness to watch out for signs of this and this? Because a lot of stories happen for individuals and their people they were dating got them into, and you shared a story of someone who was taking them to church 3 times a week. And is it because we don't want to talk about the situations, or do we have to have these very difficult conversations, like, or help people, like, if you don't want to do something, speak up quickly, because it could turn into horror story XYZ? Or what do you think we should do to try to help put a stop to it?
Oh man, you just go in there. Wow, with these questions, they're so good. I always like to defer to the experts. And one study that was actually put out by Thorn, it's an organization that does research on minor trafficking, alluded to the effectiveness of reporting of minor victims from teachers, and how vital it is that teachers explicitly are trained on how to identify potential victims, because of the likelihood that the abuse starts when they are minors. I mean, we've seen the statistics that average trafficking victims exploitation started between 12 to 14. We know that oftentimes it happens even earlier than that, sometimes later, but nonetheless, those early preteen years are vital to identification to prevent years and years and years of exploitation. So I think getting in front of the teachers is a great opportunity to enhance the visibility of potential victims. And then going to Thorn, the experts that I think are doing it so well. I think one of my frustrations in victim identification that I've seen, can I rant a little bit? I know positivity, but I have a frustration. Can I share it?
Yeah, of course.
Oftentimes, I visit different counties, different states, and there seems to be a trend on the what's the term? What a victim looks like. So,
Right.
for example, I'm in Columbus, Ohio. I get to go to Catch Court. And if you haven't heard of it, it was founded by Judge Herbert. It's like a diversion program, brilliant program that many courts across the country replicated, following what Judge Herbert started. But one of my discouragements, and now Judge Herbert only takes people that are sent to his court, so he's not out there identifying. But when I went to observe catch court, there was about 60 women that were in his program. Of the 60, all of them were white, middle-aged drug addicts. Like the kind of like when they're in the addiction that they're like their cheeks are sunken in and they got the spots everywhere from the picking, except for two Black trans women. That was it. And so here I am sitting in this court recognizing that the only victims that are being identified by law enforcement are white middle-aged drug addicts, and they're missing the vast majority of what real trafficking victims look like. Similarly, I was in another state just a few weeks ago, and I met with 5 agencies. I met with 2 direct service providers. I met with a law enforcement task force and a few awareness programs. And all of them kept using this direct correlation of trafficking and addiction. And I was very confused about that. So I finally asked them, why is there this like language that keeps connecting these two? And they said, oh, well, trafficking victims are addicts. And I said, well, just so you understand, from a national perspective, from our referral system, where we have now helped more than 1,600 survivors find resources and access to care, only 16% of them are in active addiction and need some assistance through that. So here you've got catch court, you've got this other state that are so narrow-minded in identifying this typical victim of trafficking, not recognizing that they're missing out on almost 84% of what is actually out there. And that's a problem to me.
I mean, that can go right back into directly what you were talking about of why convictions are so low because I just interviewed someone, I've interviewed like 4 or 5 people in the last couple of days, so I can't remember which day, but recently interviewed someone who basically said there is a stereotype and people are missing what trafficking victims look like and who they are for reasons like that. You think they have to look in a certain way, or that they have to have an addiction, which is another stigma, societal stigma out there. It's like, oh, for that to happen to them, they must have to be on something that messes with their minds, like, which is an unfortunate thing on multiple levels. But yeah, is that so is that something you've seen across law enforcement spectrums where they all think it's that one thing and it has to be that to even be aware, be in the purview of the court system?
Yeah, I think it's a risk. I mean, I haven't been to the entire country, but it's certainly in the few places that I have been something consistent that I think is a real risk that we need to be acknowledging in this field.
I mean, I guess without directly stating the person, what was the basic reaction when you said that?
Disbelief. Oh, they didn't believe me. Yeah, that's okay. I mean, they didn't believe me, but because that's their context, that's their experience. And so, I mean, how do you discount someone that's been doing outreach for 10 years in one area, and that's where they've identified the victims? That's hard to overcome. That's their lens. So I think that's part of us growing as a movement together, is recognizing that this is your experience, this is someone else's experience, but if we combine those experiences, we could do much more work.
Yeah, that is that is disappointing that was the reaction to it. It has to look this way for someone to actually be a victim. And that's a problem in a lot of different things.
Well, and I think that it's especially a problem when it comes to the survivor community. More than half of our referrals are self-referrals. And isn't it telling that if more than half of our referrals are from survivors themselves, and that our percentage of active addiction is only at 16%, that maybe if we were more open-minded to welcoming what a victim could look like, more survivors would come forward to identify what was happening to them. But instead, they don't fit the parameters of what's being told to them of what a trafficking victim looks like. So they're not going to self-identify as one because it's not what they're told it looks like, and they don't know.
So I think that's very interesting. Are a lot of the referrals, are they actively in a situation like they are essentially taking a risk to even reach out to you, or are they escaping a situation? Like what is typically the referral, what is their current situation in most cases?
Yeah, it varies. It varies. We have situations where, I mean, the victim calls us, and I mean, one in particular said, if you don't find me housing in the next 3 hours, I have to go back to him. I have no choice. Like the risk was so great that there was this urgency to get her away. And then we've got some that they are actually currently in jail. They know that they're getting out in 6 weeks through some type of outreach or sessions or lessons that they've taken while they were in jail, learned that actually what was happening to them was trafficking and that it wasn't their fault. So wanting help to overcome their trauma. So they'll reach out to us to find a program for when they leave the court system. Or they have housing for a couple weeks, but they're recognizing they're struggling to overcome their trauma. They've been out of the life for 6 months or 3 years and realizing this is not cutting it. I am overwhelmed trying to live like you weird squares. That's what a lot of my survivor friends call me. We're very square. I'm a very square woman. So she's like, it's hard to live like a square and they need help fitting in. And so they'll reach out.
Okay. Yeah, so are, I guess there's no way of you to actually know this, or a lot of the people reaching out, or do they have a religious background? Do they not care? Or do they just want help? Or I guess what does is I mean, I guess what is that reaction, since NTSA is faith-based? Do you see people from all religious backgrounds or no religious background reaching out?
Oh man, I wish I had our stats right in front of us because I'm going to give you some numbers and I could totally be lying. I have no idea, but I feel good about what I'm saying. I think it's right down the middle, honestly. I think about half want in our referral system, we have a spectrum. So you can choose to go to a fully integrated faith program. So this is like morning, day, and night. There's Bible studies, there's church, everybody's praying, everybody's participating in the spiritual component of the program. And then you've got over here, there's nothing spiritual happening over here. We're not doing nothing but clinical work, get the work done, process through it. And then you've got the middle, kind of like I would take Thistle Farms as an example. It's offered. You're welcome to participate. You don't want to participate? Don't participate. Go do your own thing. And that's totally fine, but it's available if you would like it. And so we have a spectrum. And I would say it's really spread out pretty evenly of where people want to land. And I think that that's wonderful. Survivors should choose how they overcome their trauma. They should choose their journey. And I love that we can help provide that for them.
Is there a number that referrals can reach out to? Because I know in a lot of systems, the Project Opal, which used to be a domestic violence hotline, they have kind of a secret number to call in case they're literally in the vicinity of the person who's doing the domestic violence. Is there any such number for NTSA, or how do people in that situation reach out to you safely?
Yeah, so it's not a secret number. That sounds very intriguing to me, Walter. No, there's no secret number. It's on our website, so anybody can call. I think of the self referrals that we get, which are about half of our weekly referrals. Maybe half of those are via phone, and then the other is they just fill out the form on our website. And hopefully within a few months, it'll actually be an app that people can just download and utilize, kind of like Airbnb for finding resources for survivors. So we're pretty excited about that. But no secret number. It's on our website. Anybody can call. Honestly, in my experience, if it is a situation where a survivor is in sight of the trafficker, they might reach out to the National Human Trafficking Hotline facilitated by Polaris. But I'm not sure if we've had a case where it was like an immediate, she's face to face with the trafficker and not able to reach out. Yeah, I don't think so.
And before we wrap up, was there anything else you wanted to say about what NTSA is working on, or any other information you think that would be important if anyone potentially is in a terrible situation and sees this would help them?
Yeah, I think if we're talking to survivors, It's okay if your story doesn't match up with what you think a survivor story should look like. It's okay to self-blame. It's okay to not identify as it being a forced situation. We're still going to help you. Whether you are choosing to be in the life or it was forced upon you, or yesterday it was forced, but you chose it today, wherever you're at in that journey, we are here to be there for you regardless. So reach out and we can hopefully help you. That's what we're here to do. If you want to work directly with survivors, talk to us, reach out to us, because good intentions does not negate harm. And I would be so thrilled to partner with you before you enter into this actual work, because it is hard, it is overwhelming, and you will cause damage without learning from others. You will. I've seen it too many times. And that damage, those mistakes are literally life or death for survivors. So let us partner with you. Let us help you create your program, learn from other survivors, learn from other programs to do it well. That's what we're here. Let's be that connector so you don't have to do this alone.
Okay, that was definitely great information, and definitely appreciated talking today. We will definitely stay in touch.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks, Walter, for this podcast. I hope you get a lot of traction on it. I'm excited to be a part of it. And yeah, let's raise awareness.
That's a great idea, and I appreciate it again.
All right. Thanks, Walter.
No, you're very welcome.